I think it's really important to start with what is an ICS and why should I care really about what's going on at ICS levels as GPs. So this I think is a really important slide and hopefully frames things. I find it really helpful. It describes different levels or different bits of the system where different things will happen. So they talk about these things called neighbourhood, place, system and region. And different populations. Now, I personally have a bit of beef with some of the population sizes, but conceptually, I think it's quite a good idea. They talk about a neighbourhood of 50,000 people. I've never met or seen a neighbourhood watch that covers 50,000 people, but maybe there is somewhere in the country. But conceptually, things need to happen, at different levels. So at neighbourhoods, strengthen primary care networks, proactive integration for defined populations. I think that makes sense. Places. Typically the same place you might have districts or borough councils, that kind of population. Systems, which often describe as ICSs, that kind of million plus, where you get people have strategy in their title, are obviously very important people. Implementation of strategic change and performance and the money, and then stuff that happens at region. So I quite like that as a concept. I also think it's quite nice that the NHS has finally woken up that actually you need different bits of the system. Often they invent one new thing, be that a CCG or a PCT or an ICS, and they try and put everything into that particular geography. This is a nice recognition things need to happen at different scales, and it's particularly important, I think, for GPs and GP networks. In terms of the ICS, where I am in Frimley, this is its kind of map here, from Farnham in the south all the way through to Slough in the north. Population about 800,000 with 3 CCGs. It's quite complicated because of the boundaries with local authorities, so there are 30 other different statutory organisations in there. But that's where Frimley is, and that's its geography, just for context. One of the things I wanted to just share is this concept of integrated care. I've just chosen one bit of the patch that's doing this, which I happen to know best. Again, I think with general practice, it's really important it's not done in isolation. So one of the things that we really tried to do as a system within Surrey Heath was work with the voluntary sector, social care, community services, mental health services, GPs and the hospital, and get everybody in a room to try and design things. And again, I don't think general practice network should develop without that wider system engagement. People may say, well, it's not up to me whether that happens. But if it is happening and you're not involved, do that. If it isn't happening, then be the kind of person that try and gets that to happen. It's also really important because this is one of the mainstays of what will form GP networks to work effectively. General practice can't do everything in isolation from everybody else. When we were developing this, one of the things that GPs said was, I can't possibly get involved in this integrated care stuff because it's just going to make my life busier. I've got to do my general practice stuff, never mind get engaged in the rest of this community. However, we found that, and it works for me as a GP, my life has been made easier with a coordinated system. I actually have more time to spend with my GP patients if the rest of the system works well. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but basically you need to have a coordinated community team with this marvellous single point of access that can order pizzas as well. MDT meetings that are regular and genuinely look after the right people, and something that can pull people back out of hospital in a coordinated way. So I guess the key thing is that needs to be happening as well as whatever happens in general practice. So what have we done? So Park Road Group Practice. When I joined in 2003, there were 7 partners, a very traditional 12,000 sort of 20-year-old building, very stable kind of partnership. That remained fairly stable until recently, where we've been through a kind of period of big change and mergers. That wasn't because we decided we would actively go and find people, it just kind of happened, but bearing in mind that general practice at scale was coming, we thought if there's an opportunity, why don't we think about how that might work. So we merged with a single-handed practice and became 14,000 patients. He then retired. We then, a couple of other partners retired. We then merged with another practice of 6,000, so we're now 21,500 with 3 partners. And that's changed a huge amount over that time. But what we were really keen to do is be really proactive about that and say, we want to design our own future, let's get on with it rather than let someone else do that. I'm not in any way suggesting that this means that everybody should merge. There are all sorts of different business models, and I'm not out here saying that is the way to do it. That was just the way that we did it. It's also meant that as well as thinking about our business model, moving from 7 partners to 3 partners, we've needed to think about our clinical model and our career model because we have less partners. So now we have 3 sites, one's NHS property owned, one's private ownership and one's partnership owned, so we experience all 3 of the different wonderful natures of owning businesses. We've also taken the view to kind of be a research-ready practice, and even despite being a training practice, we still had problems recruiting doctors. People just didn't seem to want to come to work in the area. So therefore, we've completely changed the way we work as a practice. So we've employed now 3 paramedics and triage nurses, designed the way kind of urgent care works differently on the day. We did a trial with directly employing a pharmacist, but didn't work out for us as a practice. I think that's one of the things I would encourage you to try. If it doesn't work, you can always do something different. But now the pharmacists are employed across all of Surrey Heath by the Federation, and we kind of have use of that. So it's a slightly different business model. And we've now got 10 salaried doctors. We're just about to start doing online consultations. We've got a clinical triage team who does all the on the day stuff. And I'm sure some of you may have done this, but the document management stuff in DocMan, absolutely amazing. When I came back from holiday after 2 weeks, I found that I only had 16 letters to read as opposed to 300. It was just unbelievable. So those little things that can make life easier as a practice, I would strongly encourage people to have a look at. Buy-in for anything, particularly with general practice, is really important to start from the ground up and get people in a room and say, what is it that we want to achieve? How are we going to make that work? Yep, learn from other places, but kind of co-design it yourself from the bottom up. Which is an approach that that we've used in the Frimley system to design our kind of network plan, which is this wonderful page of A4. I'm not going to go through it in detail. Other than to say, this took about 3 months of working to get to this planner page. And again, you're welcome to have this, but I would implore you, don't go to your local area and say, look, I found this marvellous planner page, we should do this, because you need to reinvent the wheel. What we did was we took the kind of NHS England kind of must-dos in terms of those pillars, which I'll go through, and then we got GPs in the room and said, where is it we're going to get to? What does that look like? What does good look like? Then if that's good, which is this right-hand side, what's a kind of couple of steps that we can get there, and then how we're going to help you to get to that step. So in terms of right scale, which is one of the NHSE asks, we said, what does network look like, just geography across the ICS? Tell us what does that look like. Then we need to think about what does that business relationship look like for that network. And then in a kind of mature network, we're expecting a kind of business model at network to be fully operational with thinking about workforce and estate usage. So you can see how it kind of progresses. So what's the right scale? The next bit is about integrated working. And that's why I was kind of labouring that point about working with other community service and social care, because unless those bits are in place, I don't think general practice is going to be able to deliver the bit that it needs to deliver of the system. So again, you need to have integrated care teams and people sharing kind of data and records on that footprint. So integrated working is really important. Targeting care, I guess that's the new buzzword is kind of population health management, which I'm sure we will hear more about. That's about taking bits of the population and thinking, how do we target them? So people living with frailty is an example of that. People with multi-disease, potentially dementia, children, look at the data in your particular area. What does that mean we need to do collectively? So then you start off by having some plans, analyse those, and then basically you're kind of tracking those people in real time. So that's a kind of progression of maturity for the networks. Managing resources. So how do you kind of use workforce across what back office functions could be done across networks? What are the career opportunities to be developed? One of the things that I was talking to a GP recently who said, I'm just about to retire, but I'd really like to carry on. So I said to this GP, I said, why don't you design your own job plan for when you retire? Tell me exactly how your week would work, and then as a network, I think we'll try and make that job happen, because we want to keep you in the system. It's much better to have you working 3 sessions a week than none if you're going to retire. So I think there's the scope for some real innovation about keeping people on. And those GPs, when they retire, they should be nurturing the kind of new generation coming through. How can we make sure that they've got that kind of peer, that mentorship going? And then right at the end here, in terms of managing resources, although this is just a few words, actually I think this is potentially one of the most significant slides. So networks have the opportunity to take collective responsibility for funding. So actually, if you wind forward maturity of a GP network, actually there's quite a powerful position in terms of looking after the resource for that population. So you get into the scale of some CCG responsibilities if that happens. And then finally, this thing called empowered primary care. I really don't like the word empowered, because I think as GPs, or as medics, we train people to be empowered, and then what happens is we come along as a system and we disempower people. So what we need to do is disempower people, but I don't think undisempower is a word, but that's where it's come with empower people. But I think it's true. There is lots of potential out there. We need to free people up to be proactive and positive and design their own system. So the way we've done that is on the ICS board we have GP as provider representatives, a seat of the system from decision making, and then this kind of nirvana at the end, a single voice from general practice. I look forward to that day when we'll get 70 practices speaking as one voice, but having some sort of collective view will be so powerful for general practice if we're going to have that influence at the top table, which sometimes is lacking because ourselves we haven't got our act together. So that's as I said, the planner page that was developed with people, and that's what practices are working towards in the Frimley system. This is the map of how those networks look. So that's the ICS divided up into various networks. One of the things that I was really keen to do was to make sure that the networks had a sensible geography, because if you're going to work with community services and social care, there needs to be some kind of relationship with those. Now the network sizes do differ slightly. So in the south of the patch, where you've got a more kind of town-centred geography, they're sort of more the 30 to 50,000 networks, which is what people often talk about. In some of these other ones, they're kind of slightly bigger networks, between just over 100,000, some of them. And we were quite relaxed in terms of how people want to work, because I think in reality people will need to work at both levels. I think you'll need to have something tight on that kind of neighbourhood place, but also I think there's some advantage of scale that will require bigger populations, particularly for some of the back office and workforce stuff. So I think both elements will need to work, and we're just kind of letting that kind of evolve. But that's the current situation in the ICS. One of the questions that we had to kind of grapple with when we were figuring this out was, what's the difference between a federation and a network? How do those kind of play into each other? So the way we've worked it was, I was really keen that we use the term GP network, which was practices working at scale to deliver benefits. That was our kind of working definition. How that could be delivered was entirely up to those practices. So if the practices want to come together and say, we will deliver a network via this federation, we were really quite relaxed about that. But that was the way we presented it, just to avoid a confusion, because we didn't want to dictate the business model of a federation, because it could be a federation, it might be a super practice that does it, it might be all the other different ways. But I think it'd be fair to say we did kind of take a while to kind of to land that. So what's happening? So all the networks themselves have been agreed, plans are being developed, delivered end of this month. We'll see what they look like. We've agreed that when the networks come together, we'll have a internal peer review where they can challenge each other, because we want to make it a learning experience. It's not going to be kind of marked with red pen and sent back. It'll be peer reviewed within the networks. We're working out how to think about demand and capacity modelling. One of the things I think would be really helpful for GPs to do is show the system how busy general practice is in a controlled way that general practice is happy with, so that we can rightly request for resources into primary care. We're going through all the kind of improved access stuff, online stuff we're rolling out, and we've nearly done all our kind of time for care actions. As GPs, we know we have the skills. One of the things that took me a while to wake up to was that consultation skills that we're all taught are so transferable into the rest of the system. It's exactly the same skill. We do it in 10 minutes, what happens in an hour-long meeting, but understanding their agenda, teasing things out, reaching a kind of common understanding, and then agreeing some action is basically exactly what happens in these kind of long meetings. So all the skills that you've got, don't kind of use them actively, because it's exactly the kind of skills that are needed. But the timescales are slightly longer. So sometimes you get frustrating because you go into this meeting and think, can't you see we could do this in 10 minutes? Actually, you just think, okay, let's just take a step back, and you have to work through it slightly longer. but it's exactly the same principle. The other thing we should never forget as GPs is we always have the trump card. So if people are in a meeting and they're saying, oh, we need to do this, if you just bring up an example of a patient story that actively shows your case, you just win hands down. Obviously choose one that's sensible, but that is your trump card, and don't forget that when you're kind of dealing with the rest of the system. Again, you kind of get all this stuff come through about leadership courses and coaching and whatever. Some of the stuff is really quite helpful to do, particularly coaching. One of the things that came through recently was an offer of some coaching, and I emailed out to lots of GPs and said, if any of you want to do anything in terms of leadership, try coaching. You won't know that you need it, but when you've done it, you'll appreciate what it's about. And a couple of GPs emailed back and said, oh, you were right. It was really fascinating, actually, having some personal coaching about my kind of leadership style, how to work in that system. So, again, if there are opportunities, I would really use them. I've already talked about co-design from the bottom up. Anything that you do will have much more chance of implementing if you bring people with you and work on it. It does take longer to implement, which is what people get frustrated about, but it will be worth it if you do that. The other thing is about kind of big scale transformation is quite rare. If you think about advances in whatever society, there aren't often big things that come along and really change things. I guess internet, big thing change things, but it's no good trying to think of the big thing that change everything. Often it's lots of little things that kind of make the difference, and I think it's going to be the same with GP transformation. Think about a bit of document management, think about workforce, employing someone else, pharmacist. If you add those things up, then it amounts to the kind of change that's needed. And again, you can achieve a lot by partnership working. The days of hierarchical hero leadership are thankfully coming to an end. It's much more about persuasion and working together, which again, as GPs, that's what we spend our lives doing, is talking to people and trying to persuade them and coax them. So again, the skills that you've got, use them because they're transferable. We concentrated on trying to get stuff done and didn't concentrate on the governance around that. So I think, which is boring for GPs anyway, because we like to do things, but somewhere down the road that sometimes leads to some of the problems. So I think governance. The other thing was, I think we didn't learn from the reinvent enough. So the reason why I guess Frimley got some of its reputation was because some of the stuff that happened in North East Hampton, Farnham, CCG and Surrey Heath CCGs in terms of integrated care kind of led to, why don't we roll this out across the patch? And I 3 months ago went into East Berkshire CCG as the chief officer, and what they'd done was said, they've done this in the south, here we go, let's just do this in the north without taking the time to reinvent the wheel, basically. So I think that's another issue that we've done. I think and I've encouraged the system for general practice to have a sustainable and transformed general practice in terms of the core bit of general practice, rather than necessarily going straight for what is perceived as an easy win to bring out of stuff from hospital into general practice. And that's just my personal view. I think general practice itself needs to find a good firm footing, rather than going for kind of the other stuff. Get core general practice working well in terms of access, sustainability, providing appointments and so on. Now, that's been a bit of tension in the system. I think the other stuff will come once network plans start to get confidence. Actually, we can look after what's core general practice, then what can we do on top? Particularly as people were saying, how you then develop network plus. One of the things, so the Frimley Trust is developing its strategy. Part of what's going to come down nationally is trusts need to think about outpatients. It's a different model. So I think that's the opportunity then for GP networks to think, actually, how do we work with the trust to provide a different kind of model of outpatients, whatever that looks like in the future. But that's just my view. I think general practice needs to concentrate on core general practice before it kind of goes for other stuff.